Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global Indigenous Perspectives podcast. My name is Shelby Brown, and today we are going to be focusing on the topic of cultural genocide and Indigenous resilience. We will be examining the subject of cultural genocide through the experiences of Indigenous peoples in Guatemala, but first we will establish the definitions of some of the terms used in this discussion. We will also be discussing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and observing specific articles which could prevent cultural genocide from taking place in the future. Lastly, we'll be discussing Indigenous resilience from the perspective of 3 Indigenous groups in Canada. So to start, we should ask, what is genocide? Genocide is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. What is cultural genocide? According to Sandahar's article titled Cultural Genocide in Tibet, the failure of Article 8 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in protecting the cultural rights of Tibetans, cultural genocide is the non-physical destruction of an ethnic group. The term genocide was coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin around the year 1933. The word is derived from the Greek word genos, meaning tribe, and the Latin word cide, meaning killing. To better understand the concept of cultural genocide, we should ask ourselves, what is culture? A well-known anthropologist from the early 19th century defined culture as the complex whole which includes knowledges, beliefs, religion, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired as a member of society. Culture is an integral part of any ethnic group that allows us to express our traditional and spiritual practice and helps to solidify one's identity and community. UNDRIP recognizes the importance of culture and the inherent rights that Indigenous peoples have to express their own culture, which is why culture is mentioned in a number of different articles within the Charter. Next, we will be discussing the case of Guatemala. Guatemala experienced a civil war between 1960 and 1996, which was the result of unfair land distribution, which affected many rural indigenous communities and benefited European-descended Guatemalans and foreign corporations such as the United Fruit Company. The massacre of Mayan communities took place between 1981 and 1983 and was referred to as the Silent Holocaust. Mayan communities were victims of massacre, forced disappearances, and torture at the hands of the oppressive government. The Guatemalan army initiated Operation Sophia in 1980, which aimed at halting guerrilla warfare by destroying the land in which they were hiding. Operation Sophia specifically targeted the Mayan population because it was believed that they were the ones responsible for the guerrilla movements that were opposing and resisting the government. During the time of Operation Sophia, the army destroyed 626 villages, killed or disappeared more than 200,000 people, and displaced roughly 1.5 million. More than 150,000 Mayan civilians were driven to seek refuge in Mexico. The government also initiated a scorched earth policy, which allowed and encouraged the destruction of buildings and burning of crops, killing of livestock, and tampering with water supplies. The indigenous peoples of Guatemala experienced both genocide and cultural genocide at the hands of the military dictatorship. The United Nations released a report in 1996 titled Guatemala, Memory of Silence, which suggests that the United States government played a major role in supporting and assisting genocide and state terrorism in Guatemala. Was justice ever served for the Maya? On August 31, 2009, the Guatemalan court convicted former paramilitary officer Felipe Cusinero for his involvement in the disappearances of Mayan villagers between 1982 and 1984. Although this seems like a step towards progress for Guatemala, It is important to note that this was the first ever disappearance case to go before the courts in Guatemala. Many of those responsible for the disappearances and torture of Mayan people were left without consequences, as they were able to claim amnesty and therefore avoid being tried in court. Daniel Wilkinson notes that the government's failure to put effort towards justice and reconciliation can be explained by Guatemala's history of governmental corruption, impunity for public figures, weak rule of law, and infiltration of organized crime into the country's judicial system. How could we prevent this from happening in the future? Let's look towards UNDRIP for inspiration. Articles 7 and 8 in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples protect Indigenous peoples from being victims of cultural genocide. They are as follows. Article 7 of UNDRIP should protect Indigenous peoples from any act of genocide, providing the nations honor and respect the principles of this charter. Article 7 states, 1. Indigenous individuals have the right to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of a person. Number 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any actor violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. While Article 7 of UNDRIP focuses on the physical well-being and protection of Indigenous peoples, Article 8 focuses on the cultural protection and well-being. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. So, what is resilience, and what does it look like within the framework of global Indigenous perspectives? Thomas, Mitchell, and Arsenault note in their article titled Reevaluating Resilience, From Individual Vulnerabilities to the Strength of Cultures and Collectives Among Indigenous Communities, that the concept of resilience as the capacity to thrive in the face of challenge, to adapt to threats, to change, to resist, and then to return to a steady state of well-being. And that from an Indigenous perspective, resilience can be viewed as the strength and power of the collective, and the reemergence of cultural knowledge within Indigenous communities despite centuries of colonial interference. The article also notes that the Indigenous peoples have been identified as resilient in the face of planned annihilation, assimilation, and disease, and that Indigenous resilience stems from Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from cultural and ceremonial practice. To finish our discussion, we will be looking at 3 different views of resilience from the perspective of 3 different Indigenous groups in Canada: the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Inuit. Thomas, Mitchell, and Arsenault explain how the Haudenosaunee were found to identify culture and language as essential resources for the resilience of individuals and communities as embedded in the creation story and the great law of peace. For the Métis, resilience was described as being resourceful for the betterment of family and community. For the Inuit, the need for resilience was identified as increasingly driven by global forces such as climate change, which they are responding to through research and legal challenges. To summarize, many Indigenous nations from around the world all have one thing in common when it comes to their modern histories: colonization. The rise and spread of colonization has affected the Indigenous peoples in nearly every region throughout the globe and has had many negative consequences for the native peoples, such as loss of culture, land, language, and the separation of children from their families. Most Indigenous societies around the world have been victims of cultural genocide in one form or another, but they have all shown signs of strength and resilience as well. I would like to end the discussion by saying that we have a long way to go before we can achieve true reconciliation, but it starts with each of us on an individual level. We can help right the wrongs of the past by educating ourselves and sharing that knowledge with others. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.